Hi, I'm Chris Calver from Rapid Education, and today I'm going to show you how to build the Tyrant S racing drone. Before we get started, let's make sure that you've got everything you need to complete the build. So you're going to need all of the parts from the kit, so that will be the transmitter and receiver kit, the kit of parts, the battery, so get that charged up and ready, and you're also going to need a few basic tools. So you'll want some wire cutters and strippers, some long nose pliers, crosshead screwdriver, an 8mm socket or an 8mm spanner. You can also use your pliers for this. That will be for doing the nuts up on the propellers when we get to that part. A soldering iron and some solder. Some small cable ties, some Allen keys. You can have some thread lock on hand. This will be quite handy, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on in the assembly. Some double-sided tape, or I'm using adhesive hook and loop dots. You'll also be able to use a glue gun for that part when we get to it, but double-sided tape or hook and loop is preferred. And some heat shrink sleeving. You want something that shrinks down to about 1mm, 1.5mm when it's shrunk. Okay, let's take a look at what is inside the Tyrant S kit box. Okay, so when we open the box, we've got a few manuals and stickers there. And then let's look at the components. So we've got a bag of 4 propellers, 2 Velcro battery straps, this is the video transmitter antenna. It looks a bit like a mushroom. We've got a couple of printed circuit boards. The first one is the flight controller, and it also has these little rubber grommets in there for soft mounting it. So we'll look at those in more detail. So you've got the flight controller and a selection of rubber mounts. You have 4 motor controllers. There's these small boxes with the red and black wires coming out of one end, and you'll notice that each one of the motor controllers also has a small piece of clear heat shrink sleeving already wrapped around it. So you've got 4 of those. The next circuit board that we have is the video transmitter. So this is the one with the SP2 logo on it and the wire with the RF connector on the end. And also you've got some mounting hardware in that box as well. Bag of various screws. You've got a few different bags of screws and fixings. The video camera, this is the FPV camera, so the camera that will relay the video feed from the drone to your FPV goggles. So you've got a small camera module and also some mounting hardware as well to go with that. Pack of wires and cables. These 4 black boxes, each of those contains a motor. So you have 4 of those. And finally, we've got the chassis, which is shrink wrapped. So let's open that. And the chassis is actually made up of a couple of separate parts that are cable tied together initially. So here we go, here's the chassis parts. You've got the small piece there, that's the camera mounting plate, so that's for an action cam like a GoPro or something like that. The bit with the Tyrant S branding on is the top plate, and you have the main chassis with the chassis arms, and also a circuit board as well, PCB. These are also sometimes referred to as a PDB, a power distribution board, or a PCB printed circuit board. Okay, so that is the contents of the kit. So for step one, you'll need the chassis, 4 motor controllers, the 4 motors, some solder, soldering iron, and some wire strippers. Now I've already prepared 3 of the motors, and you'll see that as they come in the kit, the wires are slightly too long, so we need to cut them shorter and tin them. So you want to cut these wires to about 10 millimeters, all 3 of them. And then strip each one individually. Like that. Make sure that the wires are well twisted together, and then from there we need to tin them. And to tin the wires, firstly you need to get a little bit of solder on the tip of the iron, and then these are quite large gauge wires, so take your time with this bit. Touch the soldering iron onto the wire and give the wire time to heat. Gently feed some solder in onto the wire and you'll see that the wires will tin quite easily, but do give it time to heat before you start feeding the solder in, and don't rush it. If it's not melting, don't worry, just let it heat a bit more. Because they are large wires, they will take a while to warm through. And there we go, that's our 3 wires tinned. Now what we need to do is take one of the motor controllers, and it's very important here to be careful with this heat shrink sleeving, because when this gets hot, so the tip of the soldering iron will make it hot enough to shrink, and then we won't be able to move it. So just slide it up out of the way, slide it over the wires at this end of the motor controller, and then what we need to do is tin the 3 pads at the other end. So again, they're quite large pads. Take your time and let them warm up. So warm the pad and gently start to feed in some solder. Take your time, and once it's hot enough the solder will just flow onto the pad like that. Same with the next one. And last one. Okay, so our pads are now tinned, and we need to solder the motor to the motor controller. Now you'll see on the motor there are 3 wires. One is clearly the central one, and then you have 2 outer ones. So make sure that you keep those lined up with the relevant pad. So the middle one does need to go onto the middle pad, and then the 2 outer ones to the outer pad. So it might be easiest to do the middle one first. So we'll just lay that over the top. And because we've tinned both, we should just be able to warm this whole joint up. And there we go, that's soldered on. Give it a bit of time to cool, because again it's a big pad, it'll take time to cool so that the solder goes hard. And there we have it, so the motor is now soldered to the motor controller. Then we can slide this heat shrink sleeving over. Careful of the components on the back there, because it will get caught on the way. Slide it all the way over, so that we can now work with this end, which is the power supply end. So we've got three wires going into the motor controller. Positive, the red one, negative, the black one, and the signal wire, which is the white one here. And we're going to solder this now to the power distribution board on the drone chassis. So first thing I'm going to do is just cut this cable tie which holds the parts of the chassis together, because the only bit we need at this stage is the power distribution board. And you can see here we've got 4 areas, ESC 1, 2, 3 and 4, and this is where we need to solder the motor controllers to. And you've got a positive pad, a negative pad and a signal pad, which is denoted by the wavy line in each corner of the PDB. So again, we need to tin our pads before we start. Big pads again, so take your time. Let them warm all the way through. And keep feeding the solder in. See, as the pad starts to heat, the solder will flow. The last one. And the wires will be pre-tinned from the kit at this end, and so now we need to solder them on, making sure that we put them to the correct pad. So there's a slight crossover here for the signal wire which goes to the middle, the white one, the red one to the positive pad, and the black one to the negative pad. So let's start with the positive. Give it a few seconds to cool. And we'll go on to the signal, which goes to the middle. And finally, the negative, which is the black one. Take your time, let it heat up properly. Sometimes it feels like you need about 6 hands to do soldering. So there we go. That's our first motor and motor controller soldered to the power distribution board. And we need to repeat that for the other 4 motors and motor controllers. So now we need to heat shrink the sleeving around the motor controllers. And so ideally for this you need a heat gun, but you can cheat and do it with a soldering iron as well. I'm going to use a heat gun. So I'm going to slide the heat shrink sleeving over so that the PDB end, it's covering the terminals here, the solder terminals here, and at the motor end it's also covering the joints that we soldered there. So the idea of this is just to electrically insulate the motor controller. And so then I'm going to use my heat gun to warm that up, and you'll see that it shrinks around and makes a nice tightly wrapped electrically isolated shield around the motor controller. So I'm just going to crack on and do the other 4. And now we need to mount the motors onto the chassis. So make sure you've got the chassis the correct way up. And so that's with the machined part at the top. And you'll also see you've got this little isolating washer. And make sure that is sat in the chassis. And then lift up the whole assembly and place it on top. What we need to do now is screw the motors to each of the chassis arms. And so we need the square-headed type screw. So you've got lots of different types of screws in your kit. You're looking for the ones with the sort of square cheese head type. And of those, there are two different lengths. It's the shorter ones you want. So let's have a look. The shorter ones there, and these ones which are ever so slightly longer. So it's the shorter one that you need for this part. And each motor is secured by 4 of these smaller screws. So if we turn the chassis over, and you're basically just putting the screws through the holes in the chassis and into the threaded holes in the motor. Now this is where you can use some thread lock. So what thread lock does is it's kind of like a glue, and it dries in the absence of air. So if we apply a tiny bit to the thread of one of our screws, it's just the tiniest little drip that you need. And then pass it through the chassis into the threaded hole in the motor, and do it finger tight, and then do the other 4 for the same motor as well, applying a tiny bit of thread lock if you want to use it. You don't have to use it. If you don't use it, it's much more important to regularly check that these screws are not coming undone, because vibrations can cause them to come loose. So it is advisable to use a bit of thread lock if you can. And once you've got all 4 screws in finger tight, take your Allen key and tighten those off. And then you need to repeat that process for all 4 motors. And so now we've got the 4 motors screwed onto the chassis. The last thing we need to do is use the cable ties to retain each of the motor controllers, and so it just keeps it held firmly against the chassis. So pass your cable tie through the slot at the rear of each arm and wrap it round the motor controller. We can tighten these off fully later on once we've completed the assembly, but for now that will just help us to hold everything in place. Now we're going to fit the video transmitter and the flight controller to our chassis. So for this step we're going to need the crosshead screwdriver, some pliers, the chassis that we've already assembled, the video transmitter, so that's the PCB with the RF cable marked SP2. We'll need the flight controller, that's the other PCB that you've got, the 4 rubber washers that are packed with the flight controller, plastic nuts, plastic screws, and then we've got 2 different sizes of spacers, so some smaller ones and slightly thicker ones. There should be 4 of each of those. So the first thing we need to do is fit the rubber washers to the flight controller. And so they just push in to the mounting holes in each corner. And what the rubber washers do is they prevent vibration from affecting the sensors on the flight controller. Remember, the flight controller is the brains of the drone when it's flying, and we don't want vibration to affect the readings on the accelerometer. So we're going to mount those. It's called soft mounting. And what we need to do is take the 4 plastic screws and feed them through the 4 holes that are in the central part of the chassis. These are ever so slightly countersunk, these 4. So the screw passes all the way through. And so this screw is going through the chassis, through the washer, the insulating washer, if you remember, that's underneath the flight controller, underneath the PDB, and then through the PDB itself. Then the first piece that we need to put on is the small spacers, so a small spacer on each of those screws. And then next it's the video transmitter. Now, where this yellow connector here is, this is the battery connector, that's the back of the drone. And the RF cable needs to point towards the rear. So then we put that over the top of all 4 screws. And it's spaced away from the PDB. That's a silly idea trying to pick that up. Spaced away from the PDB by the 4 small spacers. Next, we're going to put the 4 large spacers on. And those are used to keep the flight controller spaced away from the video transmitter. And with the flight controller, you want to have the USB socket, so you've got the USB socket here on one side, facing to the right hand side of the drone. Put that over the top of the screws. And then we're going to secure all of that using the plastic nuts. So for now, just do those finger tight. And then finally, we need to tighten those up. And because these are plastic nuts and plastic screws, be very careful not to over tighten them. So we're just going to hold the nut and tighten the screw. If you over tighten them, you'll find that the nuts split. So you need to be careful not to over tighten. And that gives us our video transmitter and flight controller safely mounted to the chassis. We're going to mount the FPV camera to the chassis now. So for this tools, you're going to need a screwdriver and some pliers. And then parts, you'll need the camera mount, which consists of 2 parts, the ring and the base plate. The camera itself, there will be, in the same pack, you'll find some screws. You've got 4 screws that are one length, and then a slightly longer screw, and then 5 very small nylock nuts. Quick note about the camera itself. On the back, there is a very small switch that you'll see there that can be flicked from one position to another. We're not going to try and show you this on camera because you'll never see it, but it is marked with an N at one end and a P at the other. That's to switch the camera between NTSC and PAL mode. Have a Google and a read up if you want to know what the differences is between those. I would say probably leave it on the N, on the NTSC mode for drone racing. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is fix the base to the chassis. So the base sits right on the front of the chassis here, and we need to pass the 4 shorter screws through from the underside of the chassis and through the base, and then mount with a nylock nut on the top. So I'm going to do these one at a time. It's a bit fiddly, so you're not really going to see this, but you can see exactly where I'm putting the screws. I'm just going to put all 4 in finger tight first before I go and tighten them up with the screwdriver. Make sure that the nuts go on the top. You don't want the nuts sticking out the bottom. The screws will sit nice and flush on the bottom of the chassis to prevent them picking up any dirt. So once you've got all 4 fitted finger tight, you can then use your screwdriver and pliers to hold the tiny nuts and do them up properly. And then once you've fitted the base, we then need to fit the ring. And you can see on the ring here, one side, no, these are both the same, so it's fine. You can just place the nut into one side, and it's got a hexagonal cutout, so it will actually retain the nut for you. And that needs to go either side of the camera mount. And because it's going to hold the nut there for you, you can tighten it up. And you won't need any pliers or anything on the nut. Just keep your finger on the other side so it doesn't push the nut out the other side. Now this screw here is also used to adjust the amount of friction that's on this and how stiff this will be to move, because what we now need to do is push the camera into it and make sure this stays the right way up. That's the lens cap there. We'll leave that on for now. So the right way up is, if you take the look at the back of it, you've got this little connector here. The little connector should be in the bottom left when you place it in. So we'll push the camera in. It's like a friction fit into there. And then this screw will be the tension that keeps this in position when we focus, when we aim the camera later on in the setup. So that's it, the camera is now mounted. We're now going to fit the spacers that will hold the upper deck of the chassis when we fit that. And so there's 2 different lengths of spacers. You've got 6 of these shorter spacers and 2 longer ones. And you'll also need 8 of the longer cheese-headed screws. Now these go into the 8 positions that you can see around the top of the centre of the chassis, and the screw will be passed through from the bottom and the spacer screwed to the top. The longer ones go in the 2 front holes. So I'm going to mount one of the longer ones. I'm going to use a tiny bit of thread lock again on the screw, just the smallest little drip to stop these vibrating undone. So passing the screw through the bottom of the chassis, thread the spacer on, and then when it's in position, I can then just tighten that off with my Allen key. And I need to fit the other 7 spacers to the chassis. And now we need to plug in some of the wiring harnesses to our drone. Most of the wiring harnesses come ready assembled in the Tyrant S kit, so there's no soldering or assembly for us to do. We just need to make sure we have the correct harnesses. And so the first one is this very short 8-wire harness. It has the same style connector on both ends, so you need one of those. And you need this slightly more complex wiring harness that has the large connector at one end, and out of that we've got a small 2-wire connector with a black and a red. That goes to our buzzer. Then we have a 3-wire connector that has a yellow, black and red. That goes to our video camera. This slightly different style connector with the latch on it and the red, black and white wires, that goes to our video transmitter. And finally, the power supply, again, it's just a 2-pin connector with a red and black wire. So on this one, the ones we just need to be careful not to confuse are the buzzer and the power supply wire. So buzzer at this end next to the video, and power supply at this end. We just need to be careful not to mix those up. And the sockets that they're going to go into on the drone. So this is the main connector on the flight controller, and so that's where this one's going to go. The buzzer is going to go into this one here, and that's labelled buzz on the PDB. You can see that there. The video connector is going to go into the socket on the back of the video camera. This video transmitter connector is going to go into the video transmitter, which is the bottom of the printed circuit boards that we fitted earlier. And then finally, the power supply connection that will run to this 2-pin connector here that's labelled VCC and GND. So that's the positive supply and the ground. So let's start by plugging the main connector into the flight controller. It'll only go in one way up. So I'm just going to push that in until it's all the way home. And then we'll start from the buzzer end. So this first wire is going to go into the buzzer connector. And again, it will only go one way round. These connectors have got guides so they can only go in the correct polarity. You can't put them the wrong way around. So in goes the buzzer. The next one is the video signal. Then we have the video transmitter. So this needs to loop back round and go to the video transmitter that's underneath the flight controller. And push that in until it clicks in. And finally, the power supply that goes into our VCC and ground. So that's that harness complete. Then we need to use this small shorter wire with the 8-pin connector at each end. Doesn't matter which way you do this, but it needs to go into this connector on the top of the flight controller and this connector on the PDB. Again, they're polarity fixed, so you cannot put them in the wrong way round. Push them home. And that's it. So that last wire that we put in, this one is going to send the, this one carries the signals that go to each of the motor controllers to control the motor speed. Now we need to fit the receiver. That's the part that takes the signal from your transmitter, your controller, and passes it to the flight controller. And for this we do need to make a small wiring harness to connect the receiver to the flight controller. So you'll need to get your FlySky transmitter and receiver kit. And in there you'll find the transmitter, and underneath there is also a little bag with the receiver and a wiring harness in. And they've also very kindly given you a piece of double-sided adhesive tape there as well. So I mentioned earlier that you'll need some double-sided adhesive tape. That is supplied in the FlySky part of the kit. So for this part we're going to need the drone chassis as far as we are up to this stage. We're going to need the receiver, which is this little black box with the aerial on. We're going to need the wiring harness from the receiver. And we're also going to need this small 4-wire wiring harness from the Tyrant S kit. So it's just 4 individual white wires. And what we're going to have to do is splice these two harnesses together. Now on the harness that came from the transmitter and receiver kit, you have two connectors coming out of it, one with a single yellow wire and one with the black, red and white wires. So the first thing we're going to do is take some wire cutters and somewhere in the middle of that wire, just cut it in half. And we can discard these two black connectors. We don't need those for this build. And we need to retain the small white connector with the rest of the wires. And you want to untwist the black, red and white a bit, because they're the ones we're going to be working with. And you then need to strip and tin those wires. I'm just going to get my soldering arm warming up whilst I'm stripping the next one. And with the white wire, we can shorten this ever so slightly. We don't need all of it. So I'm going to cut a chunk off of those, discard those wires. And again, I need to strip and tin these four. You're also going to need your heat shrink tubing for this part, and you want to cut 4 small lengths of heat shrink tubing. These are just going to help us insulate each of these connections when we solder the wires together. And I want to slide one piece of heat shrink over each of the 4 white wires and keep it out the way at the bottom. So that once we solder the two harnesses together, we can then slide this back over the joint and shrink them. Okay, now it's important to get these wires in the right order. And so the first wire on the right hand side, and it's important we're looking at the correct side of the connector, so you can see on one side we can see the pins on the inside of the connector, and on the other side you can't, it's solid. So let's look at the top side and work from right to left. So the right one is the ground, that's going to go to the black wire. The next one is the 5 volts, that's going to go to the red wire. The next one is the PPM signal, that's going to go to the yellow wire, and the final one is the S bus, and that's going to go to the white wire. So let's do the ground first. Really important to get these the correct way round. And the next one is the red wire. This is probably the fiddliest part of the whole build. It's handy to have an extra pair of hands sometimes when trying to solder like this, or an assembly aid. Next is our PPM signal, that's the yellow one. Making sure I'm getting the 3rd wire. The more you have already soldered together, the harder this becomes. Try and get the two wires as straight as possible as well. And finally, our S bus signal, which is the white wire. Just going to untangle this a little bit further so that I've got more wire to play with. And then we're going to need to bring the heat shrink over each of those and use the heat gun to shrink it down. So I'm going to do these one at a time. If you try and do them all together, what you'll find is you'll shrink one in the wrong place. And then they'll be stuck. Yeah, it shows my soldering wasn't particularly great there. I'll redo that one. There we have our completed wiring harness. Now the white connector goes into the flight controller now. So into this socket here on the flight controller, we have the USB socket on one side and this socket on the other. So we put our white connector into there, and the other half goes into the socket on the receiver. And this will only go in one way up because it's a polarized connector. And then we have our receiver wired in to the flight controller. So for this step we need the top plate, this L-shaped bracket with the hole in it, and so this is the mounting for the video transmitter connector. And also with that you've got a shake-proof washer, a pair of shake-proof washers and a nut, so they're sort of gold in colour, you can spot those. We've got the piece of self-adhesive sticky tape that came with the receiver in the FlySky box. And finally a pair of small silver screws and some little black washers, and they're going to be for mounting this bracket. So firstly let's mount the bracket to the top plate. So it goes onto this section at the back of the top plate. Place the bracket on like this, and then using the two small screws and a washer on each. Mount that on. Then we need to put the connector for the video transmitter aerial through the hole. Followed by, sorry, let's put that through again. Put the sort of star-shaped vibration-proof washer on first. through the bracket, then the spring washer and the nut. And tighten that up with a spanner, or you can use a pair of pliers. And tighten it down against the spring washer. And now we need to mount our receiver to the top plate using the sticky tape. Now the important thing here is the bind button. So there's a small button here with this labelled bind. We want to be able to get to that even when it's mounted to the top plate. So the idea here is to get it so that the bind button is visible through the hole in the top plate, so that we can press it once it's fully assembled. So what I'm going to do is get this adhesive pad and peel the backing off. And as we all know, it's always good fun to try and peel these things off. And stick that onto one side of the receiver. Make sure you don't cover up that bind button. We do need to be able to get to it. And then peel off the top side. And then we want to stick it to the underside of the top plate, making sure that we can see the bind button. And then stick it down nice and firm. And then you can take the aerial and feed it up through this hole behind the receiver, just to keep it nicely out of the way. And now we are ready to mount the top plate. But before we can fit the top plate, we need to slightly shorten these screws because they'll stick up higher than these standoffs that the top plate is going to sit on. They're only plastic screws, so we can trim them off with a pair of side cutters or a knife. So I'm just going to cut them off just above where the nut is. Careful not to cut any wires. And now that'll give us plenty of space to fit the top plate. To fix the top plate on, we need the dome-headed Allen screws and 2 of the longer cheese head Allen screws. You'll also need the 2 aluminium brackets, and they're to hold the top plate where our GoPro or other action camera can go. So now to actually fit the plate, make sure that you don't trap any of the wires, so feed them round the standoffs, make sure they're not under any tension, and sit the plate on. And then start by using the dome-headed Allen screws at the back of the drone, and use 4 of those in the first few mounting points. Now you can use thread lock here, but because the top plate needs to come off from time to time for maintenance, it might be an idea not to. If you don't use any, and I'm not using it, just make sure that you check that these screws are tight after every flight. With the first 4 screws in, we now need to use these aluminium brackets, and they are going to sit between each of these long standoffs and the chassis. So for this first screw, this is where we need to use our longer cheese head screw. Which is a slightly larger Allen key. And for the front one is another one of the small dome headed tight. Same on the other side. And finally, our action camera plate mounts on top of those brackets. So it sits at an angle, sits at about 45 degrees. And we're using the last 4 dome-headed screws to mount that. And our drone is starting to take shape. So the last things left for us to do is to tighten and trim up our cable ties, fit the propellers, fit the video transmitter antenna, and fit the battery strap. So let's start with the cable ties. So we just need to make sure that these are nicely tightened off. And then when they're tight, just trim the excess from each. And now we're going to fit the battery strap. So you want this with the shiny, so on one side you've got some hook and loop fastener, on the other side it's quite shiny. So with the shiny side and the Diatone logo up, feed it underneath the top plate, and then it just loops round onto itself. And so that's going to be used to retain our battery. The video transmitter just threads onto the socket at the back, so we've got a nut there that we can turn, so we just place that on and tighten it up. It's important to remember you should never power your drone up without the video transmitter aerial connected. It's because the video transmitter relies on having a load, and in this case the load is the aerial. If we don't have it on, the video transmitter can get extremely hot and burn itself out. So you never want to switch it on without this aerial connected. The last thing is the propellers, and on the face of it all of the propellers are the same, but there are 2 slightly different ones. So we have clockwise and counterclockwise propellers. So if you pick one up, you can see there's a number printed on it. So this one is 5042L. The 50 part refers to the diameter, so in this case a 5-inch prop. The 42 refers to the pitch, so that's how far the propeller will effectively travel through the air for one rotation. And then the L and the R is left and right, so left being counterclockwise and right being clockwise. And it's important to get the propellers in the right place on the drone, otherwise it just won't fly. So the front right motor turns counterclockwise, so that needs an L propeller. The front left turns clockwise, so that needs an R propeller. The back left turns counterclockwise, so that needs an L. And the back right turns clockwise, so that needs an R. With some drones, you'll find that clockwise and counterclockwise motors have differing threads. So the idea being that as the motor is turning, it tightens the nut that's attached to it. And because they turn in different directions, you have both left and right-handed threads. The Tyrant S doesn't use that principle. All 4 motors have the same direction thread on. So you have 4 nylock nuts, so 4 anti-vibration nuts to hold them on. So then you need to thread the nuts onto each motor. And then using an 8mm spanner, you can then tighten those down to retain each of the propellers. And that's it. The assembly is complete. So now you've completed construction of your Tyrant S racing drone, be sure to check out the configuration video to see how to set it up before your first flight.